Thank you so much. And just to introduce myself, I'm a former ASD mom, or always an ASD mom. My kids went here for 14 years, and the last one graduated in 2019. Next week, they'll both graduate from their masters, one from the USC in law and one from Georgetown in politics and international relations. So we had many happy years here, and it's so nice to be back. So Dr. Maima was talking to me about maybe doing a talk on healthy bones, and here I am to talk about it because there's so much controversy about this topic, especially in children. What do we feed them, etc. So it's really important, healthy bones. This is a painting by Gustav Klimt. Some of you may know him for his famous painting, The Kiss, or the movie, The Woman, The Golden Woman, or something like that. So here is a child. And in childhood is when kids, really should be consuming calcium to build peak bone mass. And a woman which you have a lot of demands on your bones and your body as far as pregnancy, breastfeeding, and then with age and postmenopausal, women especially get osteoporosis, which can result in fractures, the sort of hunchback deformity, we call it kyphosis, and many other consequences. And now as we are living longer, older people tend to fall and fracture, and that's one of the biggest causes actually of death in older people is fracture. So we are here to make sure we preserve our bones, we don't reach that state where we're osteoporotic or having an increased risk of fractures. So this is how it looks. Our bones are not like a solid mass. There are lots of, these are trabeculae, or lots of holes. That's why, we are light. If we were just a solid mass, we'd sink. And this is an osteoporotic bone. You can see how fragile. This is looking at it under the electron microscope. You can see how fragile the bone looks and the bits look. And there's an increased risk for fracture when a bone looks like that. So what is osteoporosis? It's defined as a fragility fracture. So if someone just falls, if you fall off a step and you twist your ankle and you break your bone there, that's a low trauma which should not have caused a fracture in an otherwise healthy person. So if you fall from a standing height and you break something, that's called a low trauma or fragility fracture, and the person should be immediately evaluated for osteoporosis or a low bone density. Okay, and these are not really fragility fractures. Some people fracture their ribs or fracture their spine. Those are not or a stress fracture from walking too much. Those are not fragility fractures. They're basically when somebody trips and falls, or not a high impact fracture. So again, here is the difference between bone in a young person and an elderly person. So you're just getting a good idea of what our bones look when they are healthy and not healthy. So bone density can be diagnosed on the basis of, or your low bone mass can be diagnosed on the basis of something called a bone density test or a DEXA scan. And then you will be getting your bone density read to you or reported as either in the green zone, which is normal, or in the yellow zone, which is osteopenia, or in the red zone, which is osteoporosis. And the way they actually measure a person's bone density is comparing your bones to that of a young person who's defined as a 35-year-old person. So then you'll have certain standard deviations below a young adult, which increases your risk for, why do they look at it like that? Because that sort of increases your risk for fracture. So the lower the bone density, the increased risk of a hip fracture or a spine fracture. And again, a hip fracture is one of the most deadly things people can suffer. The mortality within a person who sustains a hip fracture, such as after an osteoporosis, after a fall due to osteoporosis and a hip fracture, and an elderly person has a 20% risk of dying within the year and a very high risk of being disabled. So hip fractures are really not a great thing. Besides your bone density test, there are other risk factors for fracture, and this is really important to know. Age, smoking, female gender, low body mass index, so this is one of the few places where it doesn't help to be super thin. Previous fragility fractures, if you fell and you fractured something, you have a very high chance with your next fall you will definitely fracture. Parental history of a hip fracture. If either of your parents had a hip fracture, it puts you in a high risk category because there's a lot of genetics at play in how your bone density works. So when we have children in bone health, when you have children who keep fracturing with low impact trauma, that you should also be concerned about their bone density and their bone health. So in children, low bone density is not diagnosed only on the basis of a bone scan or a bone density scan. Okay, so in children, if they have vertebral fractures for no good reason, and not with high energy trauma, if they fall off a tree and break a bone, that's normal. But a low energy trauma, that's something we should be concerned about in children. So we need to then decide whom we treat and how we treat people, and I'm going to come to that. But what have we established now? That if you have fractures with a low impact fall, that is something or a concern for osteoporosis or low bone density. If you have a bone density test which shows that you have a low bone mass, you're again at high risk of fracture. If you have other risk factors for low bone density, such as an older person, or you have a family history of a hip fracture, or you yourself have had a previous fragility fracture, you are at high risk for a subsequent fracture. Peak bone mass. We all develop our peak bone mass at age 20 to 30. Around here is when our peak bone mass develops. And after menopause, it's sort of all downhill. The peak bone mass, our bone mass definitely goes down. All right, but many factors play into this. Where you can reach, not determined only by hereditary factors. So a person who's hereditary going to have strong bones, or if your parents had strong bones, you're going to reach a higher bone mass. But your calcium and vitamin D intake is really important at these critical years of childhood and early adulthood, to be able to reach between the difference between the blue and the red is not just determined by your genetic factors, but other factors as well, such as your calcium and vitamin D intake, as well as exercise and loading the bones. So these are really important. And if you had other things which determined or reduced your bone density in these years, such as if children were put on steroids, or they were smoking, or vaping, which is important, that's new, there's new data on vaping and bone mass, it will decrease them from that potential peak to this peak. So calcium and vitamin D intake is important in childhood and early adulthood. And people are like, there are a lot of studies or this controversy about, does this really work? Does calcium really work? And yes, it is very important, and it does work. So the medication checklist, this is important to know, especially if children or adults are taking certain medicines, such as steroids. So children with asthma, for instance, may need to be on oral steroids for a long time. If you're taking anticonvulsants, like for seizures, for epilepsy, any cancer treatments, people who had cancer treatments will always be checked for their bone mass and their bone density. These are important. Proton pump inhibitors, these are the acidity treatments. And people think that they can just keep popping Nexium or these anti-acidity medicines for long term, and they're really bad for your bones. Prevent absorption of calcium. And SSRIs are the antidepressant tablets, such as Prozac or things like that, which again can lead to low bone mass. So very common medications, but people are on them long term, and they can affect your bone density. So just to be aware, you can't stop those medications maybe, but to be aware, to be more vigilant, to take care, to do a bone density test if needed. Also, when someone diagnoses you with osteoporosis or low bone mass, there are certain tests which may be done, such as a vitamin D test, thyroid test. So thyroid under or overfunctioning can also affect your bone density. So other conditions can affect this, and cancer also is one. So what does this mean for us and for you all? First of all, lifestyle changes. We want to remove the secondary risk factors, such as smoking. We want to, maybe some people will need medication to improve their bone density. So first of all is quit smoking. There's no doubt that smoking is like the worst thing. Not only does it lower bone mass or the mass of bone, but also lowers the quality of bone. So that's the number one thing. Alcohol, it's quite a bit of alcohol you need to drink to lower your bone density or increase your risk for fractures, more than 2 or 3 drinks per day. All right, coffee, everyone's drinking coffee. There's a question mark about coffee, but it seems like if you're getting more than 3 cups of coffee per day, you might be getting into that problem. Carbonated drinks and beverages. There's a lot of data for things like Coke and Diet Coke, but certain people are concerned even about just fizzy water, carbonated water. There's not a lot of evidence for that causing low bone mass. I had a lady who was severely osteoporotic. She would drink like 20 Perriers a day. She only drank Perrier, nothing else. So there may be a risk, but it's not really very fully established. Malnutrition, anorexia nervosa, eating disorders, low protein intake is definitely a problem, and this needs to be addressed. A lot of what we know about osteoporosis comes from the Women's Health Initiative in the United States, where these women were followed over a period of years, and we collected data on who did well and not. So a lot of people will say you don't need calcium, you don't need calcium supplements, but we got a lot of our data from here. And these are well-published studies, and they are called meta-analysis as well, where you take many different studies, put them together, and get a consensus opinion. So from that and from many other studies, we get some ideas of what type of nutrition you need. First of all, protein. So lots of studies have been done on high versus low protein intake and bone health in adults. And they've done many systematic reviews, meta-analyses, etc. And we really need to have protein in our diet. So the recommended intake is 1 gram per kilogram body weight, but for bone health, and if you want to lower your incidence of fractures, that's 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight. So if a person is vegan, for instance, they really need to be taking care of protein intake, and that's where this is very, very essential. So what about calcium? Everyone's afraid of calcium supplements. They say it causes kidney stones, it causes heart attacks, and there's a lot of controversy. My patients will first say, I don't want to take calcium because my cardiologist said I should not be taking calcium, and there's a lot of controversy about this issue. So drinking milk and taking calcium supplements in some studies did not decrease the risk of fracture in many studies. So that's actually surprising and counterintuitive. But all osteoporosis recommendations and guidelines around the world suggest that we get 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium through our diet and supplements if needed. So one of the things here is many of the studies were done on the nurses, the Framingham nurses study out of Boston, where they looked at nurses who had a high dietary calcium intake. They were drinking a lot of milk, eating a lot of yogurt, and then in addition taking a high dose of calcium supplements and these people were at some increased risk for calcification in their arteries, and based on that, certain fears were formed in society. But if you're getting enough through your diet, then you don't need to take a supplement. But many of us, or most of us, are not getting enough in our diet. There's only a risk with overdose if you're taking too much of it, as I just mentioned. And also, calcium cannot work alone. You need magnesium, vitamin D, vitamin K. If you don't have adequate vitamin D and you're taking calcium, the calcium does not get absorbed and go to the right place, which is to your bones. It acts through a complex mechanism of the parathyroid hormone, etc. And the calcium maybe goes into your arteries and leads to calcification, or goes into the kidneys and leads to stones. So if you're taking calcium supplements, your vitamin D needs to be good, your magnesium needs to be good, your vitamin K needs to be good. So again, this is where I'm just showing the slide again, because it's really important for calcium, vitamin D, and exercise to go from what your hereditary peak bone mass will be to the maximum peak bone mass which you can achieve. So calcium intake in children, the recommended daily allowance is 1,300 milligrams per day through diet. All right, so the recommendation is to get it through diet and not through supplements. So calcium mainly comes through dairy, fortified juices, nuts, yogurt, etc. But as I just mentioned, calcium cannot work alone, and I put in these circles to show how important the other factors are as well. You have vitamin D, magnesium, zinc, K2, and other minerals, as well as protein, as I mentioned to you. So we're again talking about calcium sources, and we're going to talk about this a bit more. And of course, it'll jump. So 1 cup, 200 ml of cow's milk or other milk will give you 300 mg of calcium. Similarly, yogurt will give you 300 milligrams of calcium. A cube of cheese will give you 250 milligrams of calcium. So we're trying to even ourselves out to around 1,000 milligrams of calcium per day. Kefir is a good source because it has probiotics. Salmon with bones, if you have half a can, it's 240. Similarly, sardines, half a can, 200 mg. Whey protein powder is usually fortified. 1 scoop has about 200 mg. Now we also come to what everyone says is, I eat a lot of green leafy vegetables. So 1 cup of green leafy vegetables will give you 100 milligrams of calcium. But I'm going to talk about bioavailability a little bit later. White beans, I like sesame seeds over there. Just 1 tablespoon gives you almost 100 milligrams of calcium. So, tahini, for instance, is made with sesame seeds. And almonds also, like a few almonds, like one quarter of a cup of almonds will give you 100 milligrams almost. White beans is great. And cottage cheese is less than the brick or other kinds of cheese. Also, there are some studies about milk versus yogurt. Now, most adults, or many adults, especially Asian adults, Southeast Asian and South Asian adults, are lactose intolerant. Kids nowadays are lactose intolerant. So yogurt usually is not such a bad thing. If you're lactose intolerant, you can tolerate yogurt because, as you know, the lactose is in fermented foods, is digested, and you can tolerate yogurt. So fermented foods such as yogurt and kefir may be a good source when you are lactose intolerant. But I'm actually like somebody who personally doesn't believe in store-bought yogurt for the probiotic content because they're heat treated. And if you leave your yogurt in the refrigerator even for a month, your store-bought yogurt is not going to go bad. But if you made yogurt at home, it would go sour in about 2 to 3 days. So I'm not really believing there's a lot of probiotics in store-bought yogurt. But don't kill yourselves now trying to make yogurt. But it's just something where everyone thinks, oh, I eat a lot of yogurt, so I'm getting a lot of probiotics. But I think it's more about the fermentation with our foods, which we need to be cooking at home and letting things ferment, which is something important. So probiotics are important, and I'm going to come to that a bit later. But here there's some studies about milk versus yogurt, and that's when I first also started thinking about yogurt as a better source of calcium than milk itself because it's digested better probably. And there's this huge study where in this particular study, when I looked at yogurt rather than milk, it showed that, this is looking at some 500,000 adults, it showed that yogurt was better digested and a better source of calcium and helped to improve bone density better than milk alone. Now, talking about spinach and the green leafy vegetables, we have something called oxalates and phytates, which actually can lead to kidney stones. So the spinach and whole bran cereals, the bioavailability of calcium on these are a little bit low because they bind in the gut to oxalates and phytates, and you may not really be getting all of it, especially in cooked spinach. So it's really hard to get all your calcium by drinking spinach juice or kale juice or just eating kale. It's going to be a little bit hard. I'm not against them, but it's not a sole source of calcium. They have so many other benefits. So what about calcium supplements? We're not going to eat all those foods. Calcium supplements, are they bad? So as I said, they're not a bad thing if you don't have enough calcium in your diet. So now all of you could have done a rough calculation of how much calcium you're getting daily. So you can take a calcium supplement, and most calcium supplements have about 500 milligrams of calcium. And there are different types of calcium supplements, and everyone's, which one should I take? Again, there are not a lot of studies on this topic, and there's a lot of social media influencers who will tell you all sorts of things. But calcium carbonate is the most common one. It's almost like Tums, right? And it's something which can be eaten with food. You have to have it with food because it doesn't get absorbed without the stomach acid. Calcium citrate is another type which can be taken with or without food. And this one, the osine hydroxyapatite complex, is not easily available. It is available sometimes in the States. It is a better source of calcium, more effective, better tolerated for people who can't tolerate the normal calcium tablets, right? I'll let you take the picture. So again, meta-analyses, which we depend on a lot, because there'll be one study saying calcium does not prevent fractures. There'll be another study saying vitamin D is useless. But when you look at meta-analysis, when you're putting this all together, calcium and vitamin D does reduce the risk of hip fractures in some of the meta-analysis. So overall, our consensus opinion from all the studies is yes, we do need calcium. We need calcium for growing children, young adults. We need calcium later in life as well, when we are getting to the point where we're starting to lose bone. So we need calcium, and usually the daily intake is around 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams per day. Okay, so what about vitamin D? So this is Gollum from Lord of the Rings, and he lived in a cave with no exposure to sunlight, and we all know he was like hunchback and his legs were bent. That's a condition called rickets, which we used to see in the past, where kids would get all these bow legs and things like that. So I think Gollum actually had rickets. But he says, I eat fish, because his fish was his main source of food, I think. He used to eat raw fish from the movies I watched with my kids. And but you need to eat a lot of fish, that large salmon, to get just 1,000 IU of vitamin D per day. And our daily requirement of vitamin D has actually gone up a lot. All right, it's not 1,000 or 400. Initially, they said 400 IU. That was a tablespoon of cod liver oil, which was used to prevent rickets in dogs. Okay, so then on that basis, they told us all to take 400 IU. And then it increased to 1,000, and now it's 2,000 or 3,000 IU per day we need. And in people who are overweight or obese, you need a more amount of vitamin D, because fat acts as a reservoir for vitamin D. So what is vitamin D? It's actually not a vitamin, it's a hormone. So we all have the precursor to vitamin D in our skin. That's called 7-dehydrocholesterol. It's just there in our skin. And then when we're exposed to sunlight, it activates that dehydrocholesterol to cholecalciferol. And dietary intake is a very small source of vitamin D. And we need to have this activated form. It goes through the liver and kidney to give us the active form 1,25-hydroxy-D. So as you can see, like, we can't really get vitamin D through the diet. And when we wear sunscreen and we are not exposed so much to the sun, so it's hard to get, and we are living in an air-conditioned environment. Everyone says, why when we're living in a sunny country, even in UAE, in Dubai, we did some studies and we found a lot of vitamin D deficiency. But this was more interestingly among the Asian and Emirati Arab populations, and not so much among the Caucasian populations, interestingly. And I think that's because of sun exposure. Maybe people are not, like, personally, I don't go sit in the sun. So people may be more concerned about sun exposure in some cultures. Also, skin pigmentation plays a big role. The darker your skin, the more time and more sun exposure you need, because the ultraviolet light, your melanin, acts as a natural sunscreen and a natural sunblock. So if you use a lot of sunscreen, or you have darker skin, you need more time and more sun exposure to get an adequate level in your blood. So as I said, no one size fits all already. We need an optimal level in the blood of 40 to 60 nanograms. So if you think you may be vitamin D deficient, you need a blood test. Obese individuals need at least 5,000 IU per day. If they're not getting exposed to sun, take a supplement, and minimum is 2,000 IU per day. If levels are low, we give a top-up doses of 50,000 weekly for every week for about 8 to 12 weeks. What about magnesium? Now, magnesium is really important. It's been so underrated and forgotten about when we talk about calcium. So magnesium acts on both the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, which are the bone building and bone breaking cells in our bones. So bones of magnesium deficient animals have been found to be fragile, and so magnesium deficiency can contribute to osteoporosis. So we also need calcium to work with the magnesium, and the ratio should be 2:1. If you're taking 1,000 milligrams of calcium, you need 500 milligrams of magnesium. And generally, it's better to separate your supplements. I usually say take your magnesium at night. It helps with sleep a bit. It helps you to relax, and take the calcium in the morning so that the absorption is better. If they get together, they may bind together and they don't do well. In Western diets, people are lower in magnesium, and the ratio is 3:1 of calcium to magnesium. So balanced foods, leafy, I actually put something out there which was to blank that part out. Yeah, balanced foods to eat are leafy greens, seeds, and salmon, which are high in magnesium levels. Now, vitamin K, so when I went to med school, there was only vitamin K, that's all we knew, and vitamin K helped with blood clotting, right? And vitamin K came from green leafy vegetables. But now there's two types of vitamin K, K1 and K2. So K1 is, of course, the important one for your blood clotting. If you don't have enough vitamin K, you can bleed. But vitamin K2 comes from animal products and fermented foods. So this is where the fermented foods and your probiotics come in, because K2 comes from your gut, and it's very important for bone strength, your blood vessel health, and your artery health. So this is something different now, and when we talk about vitamin K2, there are two types, the MK4 and MK7. This is a very short acting type. So if you're taking a supplement, it's no use to take MK4. MK7 is a longer form, and it stays longer in the body. So this is where I think like the importance of fermented foods and probiotics come in, because that's where in your gut you produce the MK7, the gut bacteria produce your MK7, and it's really important to have enough vitamin K in your body. And there are other trace elements, B complex, zinc, copper. If you're having a healthy, balanced diet, you should be getting enough of these. There's no need to take supplements of these. I just feel like most of us are deficient in our calcium intake, or maybe a magnesium, and maybe if you're not having enough green leafy vegetables, in vitamin K as well. So that was about diet. And what about exercise? So I think in ASD, most of the kids are getting enough exercise. So it's weight bearing. Weight bearing means walking, that we need the effect of gravity on our bones. I don't know if you've all heard that astronauts get osteoporosis because there is no gravity up in space. So every time you walk, the gravity jars your bone, and there are little micro traumas to the bone. So then the bone like regenerates. So our skeleton regenerates just like our skin. The old cells come off and the new cells come in. So you keep, if you have the same bones that you were born in, it will be really fragile and it will break. So there's micro traumas which lead to healthier bones. So balance training is really important, especially as we grow older, and weight training and resistance training to build healthy muscles to help to support us and prevent falls. But all of this is really essential. So like swimming, for instance, will help with weight and resistance training, but if you're only swimming, you may not get the effects or the benefits of gravity. So walking is also an important form of exercise. And finally, there are lots of FDA-approved medications. I don't even want to discuss them. That is, if you come to the point where you're osteoporotic, you may need these meds to prevent fractures. So I'm just going to stop here and take questions, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions. So thank you. Yeah.
I might have missed this too. At the beginning, when children, we're talking about fractures, there's the growth plates too. Is that included in the as part of the bone, or if that fractures, is that also kind of a sign of weaker bones or not?
It depends on the trauma. I mean, if they had a huge trauma, that's just the location of the fracture. If they fractured higher up or there, near their knee, their growth plates could be affected. So the location of the trauma, that's not related to the weakness of the bone. The weakness of the bone is reflected by the amount of trauma it needed to break that bone. So if they fell off a tree, as I said, and they break a bone, that's normal. But if they just trip over here in school and then they break a bone, that is something you should be concerned about for a fragile bone. Yeah.
I was wondering, Dr. Basha, thank you for all this great information, but for parents that are trying to balance everything and thinking about kids and everything, if you had just a couple of key takeaways, so for anybody who's raising a child with growing bones and everything that they're going through, like little changes that they might make, what would be just kind of the key practices?
Yeah, one is calcium intake. I think everyone's worried about drinking milk. Now there are certain times when we don't drink milk, such as lactose intolerance, or if you have an autoimmune condition, or if you have allergies, asthma, they may not be able to drink milk or consume dairy products. So in that case, make sure the child is supplemented with calcium. So the main point here is about calcium. The second point is vitamin D. I think most of the kids here are getting enough sun exposure. They have enough vitamin D in their system. The smoking is a problem, and the vaping. Yeah, so I know as an ASD mom, I know. So that's something we really should discourage and talk to them about their bones. And I think especially boys want to be taller and bigger and stronger. So, we have to really recommend that. And for you as adults, I mean, all of us as women here, everyone here is a woman in the audience, all of us as women here, we really need to be taking care of our bones and making sure you have enough calcium intake, especially postmenopausal, sorry.
When do you start to worry about because like you feel normal, no? When you start to checking on.
So now you do a mental checklist. Am I consuming enough calcium in my diet? If you're not consuming enough calcium, you should take a supplement. So the recommendation to check a bone density test, to get a scan done, is one, if you've had a trauma, low trauma fracture, a fragility fracture. If you just tripped and you ever had a fracture, you must have a bone density test. Or if you're postmenopausal. After menopause, a few years after menopause, you should get a bone density checked.
Can you, like, let's say you hit 40, and do you still, like, let's say you exercise and weight train, do you still have an opportunity to build bone mass?
You don't have an opportunity to build bone mass anymore, but you have an opportunity to prevent decline. Yeah, yeah, we're done. Yeah, no, it's with we have medications which can build it, and that's for people who go down very much or are at high risk for fracture. So we calculate some risk factors, we put them into the computer, and generates your risk score, and then we give you medication only if needed, because they have some side effects as well. So yeah.
How do they do the scan?
It's just an X-ray sort of thing where it's called a DEXA, D-E-X-A. You have to be careful where you do it. Not all places are really reliable, but it's like your hip and your spine.
It's not with a heel anymore?
Oh, the heel ultrasound is not so accurate anymore, so we don't do that. This is a screening thing. Like we do that screen sometimes. So there's a thing where you just put your foot. We actually brought that machine to ASD about 15 years back, and we screened people. So you put your foot in it. If it's normal, it's great, but if it's not normal, you'll have to do a DEXA scan to get the more accurate measurement. If you did a heel scan and it was fine or high, then you're okay.
I may have missed it, but is there a difference between boys and girls in
Yeah.
their calcium intake, girls leading up to like their menstruation cycle, puberty? I mean, is there?
Yeah, so boys obviously always reach a higher peak bone mass than girls. So their peak bone mass will be higher, being boys, so they'll have heavier bones. That's related to testosterone. But girls with puberty should actually also, it doesn't make it, estrogen helps you. Estrogen helps your peak bone mass. And that's why after menopause, when we lose our estrogen, is when the bone mass starts declining.
So in like right now, like in childhood, like should their calcium intake be significantly greater? I mean, is there any data
No,
on
it's
that, or
no, it's about the same. It's about like very small children need about 400, 500 milligrams, but the daily requirement's around 1,000 for all children, even through puberty, early adulthood. Yeah.
Doctor, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. What's your take on vitamin D supplements for preschool children? Preschool, so
Yeah.
some sources would say 400 IU, others would say 600. Because we rarely measure their blood levels.
Yeah, very little children, I would say 400 IU. So like a teaspoon of cod liver oil or a fish oil or something like that, that should be fine for little children. There's not much of a difference between 400 and 600, but still 400 should be sufficient. Especially because kids do get out in the sun and do play outside. Is that it? Okay, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.